All right. Well, let's get this show on the road then, and welcome everybody to our how to break down silos with OKRs, horizontal and 360-degree alignment practices webinar. My name is Jeremy Epstein. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at the GTM Hub, and we've got a all-star cast lined up for today. Our featured speakers are Daniel Montgomery, who is the managing partner. There he is with that snowy Colorado backdrop.
Boy, is it cold. It's cold.
It is chilly. Well, that's why you got the multiple layers. You're a true Coloradan with the multiple layer. But you need a hat. You need an OKR hat or something. So Agile Strategies is a partner of GTM Hub and one of the leading organizations in the world in terms of cultivating strategic agility with objectives and key results. They specifically help organizations clarify their goals and build strategic alignment so they can generate measurable value and impact. Daniel has worked in senior consulting roles for both Accenture and Ernst & Young, and then as a VP of consulting for the Balanced Scorecard Institute. So any of you out there who are wondering about balanced scorecards, OKRs, we get that question all the time. Daniel is your man. It's your lucky day. And he's the author of the award-winning book, Start Less, Finish More, Building Strategic Agility with Objectives and Key Results. And that should be on everybody's holiday shopping list, hands down. I know I gave it to my... What's that?
It fits neatly into a stocking.
Yeah, I gave it to my kids for Hanukkah last night. They're really excited about it, and they've already made their way through it. It's amazing how adept they are. Yeah, they've already built strategic agility in my house.
Awesome.
And our other featured speaker today is Evan Campbell, who is the Chief Transformation Architect here at GTM Hub and kind of a rock star in the business agility world himself. No slouch there either. He's a senior technology and business executive with demonstrated success in multiple roles, including CTO, founder, and multiple SVP stints. He's a proven entrepreneur, and he's brought not one, but two software companies to an IPO, as well as two more firms to exits via sale to public companies. So not too shabby there. And there we go. And then assisting us here is Gracie Koester. I was trying to do the German. Yeah, I was trying to do the German pronouncement there. She's a lead consultant director of new business at Agile Strategies. She is going to be helping with the Q&A, and we highly recommend that you use the Q&A during this because we want to make this interactive. And Gracie, fortunately, is an experienced facilitator, speaker, listener, and consultant, and has a decade plus of experience in coaching and consulting in the realms of agility, strategy, leadership, and team performance. She's worked in multiple industries such as healthcare, design, advertising, tech, retail, construction, and social impact. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. This webinar is being recorded, and all of you will get a link to the recording following this, and we're looking forward to your questions and comments because we're here for you. So please do not be shy, and if there's anything that's really troubling you or our presenters are not addressing, let us know, and Gracie and I will make sure that we whip them into shape. There are some polls in the chat window, so we encourage you to take those because that's a critical part of our presentation. The presenters will probably go for about half an hour-ish, but we'll stop them if there's some really amazing questions, which we're counting on. But we want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, discussion, what have you. So without any further ado, please welcome Daniel and Evan to the show.
Thank you all for being here with us. Dan and I have a lot of fun working on kind of theoretical and experimental aspects of strategy alignment, strategy execution, strategy deployment, OKRs in general. But in particular, what we find with large organizations is that there are real challenges overcoming organizational barriers and cultural barriers for different parts of the organization, different work groups, different initiatives, different value streams across the organization to really align well horizontally. Certainly a lot of organizations have traditions of strategy execution or performance management that have pretty rigid vertical alignment. But the challenge here is more about being effective horizontally. And so Dan and I and Gracie have all put together some thoughts on some techniques that might help with that. So we're going to start with an agenda. We've already done the introduction. We're going to do a poll in a second, just a quick, fun 4-question poll that I have a link in the chat window where you can go in your browser to respond to the questions. We'll talk to the problem statement. We'll talk to the benefits of solving the problems of horizontal alignment. We'll propose some solutions around processes and behavioral type solutions, organizational design solutions, and some frameworks and tooling and techniques that help with that. And then we'll leave plenty of time for the Q&A. So let's jump over to our quick and fun survey. I'm actually going to jump over to the browser where we can actually see the results starting to come in. And hopefully you can see this. I see people are already starting to respond. Yes, this is more coherent now. What best describes your organization's structure? Your silos are mighty towers built of many layers. We're mostly organized by functional silos, but now and then we have some cross-functional structures. The third one is we're actually actively migrating from a functionally dominant organization, kind of a traditional silo, to product or value stream oriented alignment in our organization. And last is our dominant organizational alignment our dominant organizational alignment already is along products or value stream lines. Moving to the next question. Looks like we got fully half the responses here are predominantly functional silos with the occasional cross-functional structure. And then interesting that we have nobody in number 3, which is, I would have thought would have been a pretty common evolutionary state. Yeah. Any comments, Dan?
Yeah, I'm surprised by that as well. Maybe a few more will come back in.
Yeah, good. Our next question. How easily do cross-functional / departmental working groups emerge in the organization? Getting it approved through leadership of each silo would be nearly impossible because these leaders of the silos are so parochial and so interested in the performance of their own silo that they don't collaborate very well. Occasionally, a high priority initiative has cross-functional members assigned. So if it's a big important initiative, they might actually put together a cross-functional working group knowing that the initiative is more likely to be successful with that representation. The third one is we support communities of practice and functional specialties and product and project work groups pretty well. These are defined largely by the organization and stood up in a formal way. And then the fourth one is actually that it's truly organic, where the organization quickly forms and dissolves all kinds of composite or cross-functional teams very naturally as part of its behavior.
I'd be really interested at some point in this conversation to hear from the 7% at the bottom a little bit more about how that's working, because that's really that's the leading edge of evolution here. I think the second one with the 57%, we've seen that in place for, well, without dating ourselves, Evan, probably our entire careers.
Yeah, and I expected that to be the dominant model. How do we align the work of various functional or cross-functional work groups? The first one, we don't. Our silos optimize for themselves, and we only care about those local priorities. Second, we have an annual plan that captures some higher level objectives that various groups are supposed to be measured by. It's a little more your kind of traditional MBO, pretty inflexible because it's annual. Number three, we have a process that defines higher level objectives and gives us transparency to some others' high level objectives. So that's improving transparency and giving better tools for alignment. And then the last one, communication and collaboration within and between all of the groups and functions of the organization is organic, and we're all aligned to the same objectives. In other words, it's really clear that different parts of the organization can look up and make sure that they're pursuing the same objectives. And then lastly, how fast can the organization realign all people and work to a new emergent goal? The first answer, a little tongue in cheek, we'll discuss it for next year's planning cycle in the fourth quarter, maybe.
Ouch.
We'll add the topic to the, go ahead, Dan.
No, I'm just ouch.
Yeah, ouch.
A lot of us in the strategic planning business have very busy fourth quarters. And this is why we wait till the end and then define the whole thing for the next year rather than it being ongoing process.
And the problem with that is there's so much overhead and it takes so long to get these kinds of objectives into the plan that when circumstances in the real world change, oftentimes we resist the need to actually revise those objectives to map with reality, kind of analogous to the terrible annual budgeting processes that a lot of corporations, enterprises adhere to.
And I think just to illustrate this, something for the audience to think about, what happened to your annual plan around the second week in March this year? Did you have any discussion about that? Did you panic? Did you integrate what you now suddenly needed to do into your plan, or did the plan just go on the shelf?
Right. I won't read the rest of these, but boy, this year, 2020 was the object lesson in everybody being convinced that they are vulnerable to disruption and chaos and things like that, even in very, very stable businesses and industries. So obviously, the ability to actually measure how fast your organization can come up with a new plan and get alignment through all of the work and people in the organization is a really powerful measure of how adaptable and resilient an organization you ultimately have. So that's the end of our survey. Thank you for participating in that. That was very interesting and fun, I'm sure, just as I promised it would be. Let's go back to the deck. We've tackled these. Let's talk about the problem statement a little bit, Dan. Historically, our organizations, and this comes back to the era of Henry Taylor and Taylorism, the design of work as being highly specialized labor, handing off between silos. These various functional silos reflect the skills and where the various people tend to align in a traditional hardline organizational reporting matrix. But the reality is that increasingly, especially in the era of knowledge work, where competitive advantage comes from fast learning and organizational knowledge workers, value is actually created orthogonally to the silos, horizontally. And over time, that tension becomes increasing.
Yeah, so, this kind of model, the hierarchical organizational structure, goes way back. Maybe the Roman army, the church, a lot of places, and that really got enshrined in management literature with Taylor, with Sloan at General Motors. They really perfected this. And in a relatively stable kind of economy where you have very long product cycles, it actually works. I mean, there's nothing wrong or evil with this kind of approach where, and particularly if you go back a century, what was going on when Taylor was working was a very large percentage of the workforce, at least in the United States, were not native English speakers, were not educated, and you could break down jobs into very atomistic pieces and basically control what they were doing. So it was a very top-down kind of approach.
Yeah, Henry Ford, of course, being a great implementer of Frederick Taylor's theories of science, scientific management, but one of Ford's great quotes was, we've really gotten, this scientific management down, but it's just a shame that every pair of hands comes with a brain attached.
Ooh. So that's not the way things work anymore. We've been for a couple of generations now in what Peter Drucker called the knowledge economy. So we have very well-educated workers. We're in a more complex environment. People need to think for themselves and act independently and autonomously within some kind of overall alignment. And that starts to set up the problem that we're dealing with that we think OKRs really help with. So you can see what actually happens in an organization. This model, it's a mental model of an organization, this top-down idea that has only limited usefulness. It's useful for managing pools of skills. It's useful for managing budgets, but it's not the way that work actually gets done. What's actually happening is you can see that if you apply a social network analysis to this hierarchy and look at who's actually talking to whom to get things done, it skips levels, it goes horizontally, it's top down, bottom up, and sideways. And so what we're really looking at now, the value is produced by a network that's not quite as predictable as that hierarchical organization chart would seem to imply. But a lot of our thinking about how to do strategic planning and execution hasn't really caught up with it yet, which has led to a lot of problems. Back to you, Evan.
So as Dan was saying, more and more the value is being delivered, the work is getting done in informal organizational structures and work groups. We really ideally would like for those organizational work groups to have the ability to have objectives and key results and collaborate effectively with one another in a very organic and dynamic way. But creating 360-degree alignment is challenging, but the costs of not doing it are substantial because you inevitably have duplication of effort. If groups are not aligned, they're doing redundant effort potentially. The interfaces or alignment or timing of different initiatives or features or product components don't come together because of that failure to align. You also get poor accountability when everybody is working on different things with poor alignment. How do you hold people accountable for getting value delivered in a timely fashion with good quality? So all of these in aggregate produce waste, defects, misunderstandings, inefficiencies. Of course, lack of alignment and all of these frustrations, duplication of effort, the failure to integrate, all of these are frustrating to the employees, frustrating to customers, bad all around. So, the mirror image of that, the benefits of alignment, we get a clear organizational definition of value that's a North Star that all of us are paddling towards. We get knowledge and learning through the organization faster for quicker, better responses to opportunities and threats, sense and adapt. And people are engaged and feel like the work that they're doing is adding value.
Hey, Evan, Daniel, I'm wondering on that last slide, have you ever seen any economic studies or anything that sort of quantifies on an average corporation what those costs of poor alignment are? Like how, if somebody's listening and they're trying to sort of make the business case for here's how bad things are, they could say, here's, anything. Have you ever seen something like that?
Yeah, in fact, we recently quoted some numbers from Deloitte and Gallup who, study employee engagement and effectiveness as core knowledge centers. And I'll forget the exact numbers, but there's a substantial double-digit percentage of the average organization whose employees are actively disengaged, which means that they're angry, frustrated, and not only are they not particularly productive, but they're actually being deliberately destructive of value creation. And then there's another 30% or so who are disengaged. They have every intention and desire to be constructive, but because of a lack of clarity and organizational objectives, they're paddling, but they may very well be paddling entirely the wrong direction. So if you impute as just a percentage of your payroll what that 40 something or 50% of your employee base is much less effective than they should be, or even destructive, it's pretty easy to come up with some staggering hard financial numbers that imply better alignment will produce enormous financial benefits.
Yeah, I would just add that there's been, in the last 15 years, a lot of academic research done on this larger subject of strategic agility. And the way we look at OKRs are a tool for strategic agility. So what these academics have done is they break down what strategically agile organizations look like. That is, organizations that can sense and respond to change in the environment and continuously develop and deliver new kinds of value to their customers. And what you see is a lot of what we have here under the benefits are features of that. And when you add all of that up, you definitely see more longevity, more consistent revenue growth and profitability from those. And I can certainly point people toward some of those. If you're interested, let us know.
Right on, Dan. So let's talk a little bit. We're going to propose solutions in some kind of arbitrary categories that will help organizations achieve better alignment horizontally. First of all, and for those of us who come from a background in business agility, culture and mindset shift really are the key levers of almost any of the solutions that we're talking about, moving towards becoming really a more agile thinking and behaving organization. That requires a shift in leadership behaviors and styles towards servant leadership, creating capability in the organization instead of dictating or managing down. It's more about leaders recognizing that the system in which the people work needs to be improved as the greatest lever on organizational performance. And then, emphasizing sense and adapt and continuous improvement, and using data, KPIs and OKRs to actually use theory of constraints type thinking. What are our bottlenecks? How can we improve? What are leading indicators of true business impacts that our organization can measure and improve? Some of the techniques around process and collaboration solutions, let's say as a foundation for really any of this, you can't do good strategy execution without having some clarity in what the strategy is. So you've got strategy definition, strategy deployment, and strategy execution. And it really all starts with having the right strategy and having it clear and actionable enough through mission, vision, values, and the very high level objectives of the company so that it's tractable and we can plan strategy execution towards that ultimate business outcome. And then transparency. This is the strategy deployment part where the strategy can't just be defined. It has to be promulgated through the organization so that everybody knows what it is. It's transparent. It's ubiquitous. If you ask anybody in the elevator, from a VP to the janitor, what are we trying to achieve this year? You get that same consistent answer. Framing is an important part of any form of collaboration. So just as an example, we're all familiar with big room planning, where many different groups send representatives to plan together and expose their plans, influence one another's plans, put dependencies upon one another's plans, resequence work to get maximum value. Collaboration is a group sport. And so coming up with a frame for collaboration, a deliberate place that it happens, a deliberate context in which it happens is important. And then having a process to refresh and validate and adapt that collaborative plan through synchronization, cadences, meetings, tools. That coordination framing process is important to set the foundation. And then specific techniques that we've used, and Dan, jump in here if you want to talk to them, but Catchball was something that was popularized through a lean strategy execution framework called Hoshin-Conry. We're not advocating Hoshin-Conry, but catchball is a process where essentially if Dan and I were in two different teams that had some related objectives, I might articulate my OKRs and throw them to Dan with a request that he produce some OKRs that would support or align with mine. And then he would modify them. He might even ask me to change mine, and then he'd throw it back to me. And that's a classic workflow, right, Dan?
Right, right. And I think the interesting thing about catchball, the potential of that is it's not the old management by objectives idea where it's like, if Evan's my boss, what interest my boss fascinates me. So Evan's got these goals and then I come up with something to support him. Because if you're cascading straight downward in those silos, you're just going to reinforce the silos and you're not going to get that horizontal effect of improving the value that you're delivering to your customer, which is, after all, why your organization exists. So I love the term catchball. It sounds kind of playful because, if we think about that organization chart with the arrows going in all kinds of directions, you can develop OKRs across any of those vectors of communication where you see it needs to be. So what you're doing is actually empowering people to act more autonomously, negotiate their own commitments with people. And, we recognize that's not where most organizations are yet, but we think that's really the evolutionary edge where we're going.
Yep, exactly. You can throw that catchball to anybody. The joint accountabilities are created when we have an OKR that we share across organizational boundaries, or where we're both contributing key results to a higher level aggregate key result that tracks both of our contribution. Dependencies are a very reasonable thing. We don't want to turn this into some horror show from a work breakdown structure from Microsoft Project with pre and post and start first and stop and finish first or finish last. But just the ability to have a way of formally recording that Dan has an objective that depends on me achieving some key results or vice versa. And this can be up, down, horizontal, or anywhere. And we need to be able to see them from both directions. I depend on him, he depends on me. Another technique for collaboration and that works really well, I call it Scrum of Scrums. It's essentially just a scaling pattern for collaboration that says that each of our constituent work groups sends a representative to collaborate at the higher level. And this can go up many, many levels where we have representatives of representatives. And the responsibility goes up and then comes back down. And this is how you can have many, many groups have an effective collaboration with one another, because each one sends a representative to transparently show what their group is doing and also communicate what they need from the other groups, and then adjust the plan, bring it back down, and then track that over time. Two levels. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, that's very much the approach that we like to take if we're going into an organization and creating OKRs. We take a look at the strategy, we translate that into OKRs generally at the top level of the organization. Then we look at, are there some obvious value streams across the organization that may need OKRs? And then we go down to the individual teams where they develop their OKRs, being aware of the overall company and being aware of where they might play a part in a value stream. But even within, the process is not really complete, because you have to come back into something like a big room situation or a representative scrum of scrums, as Evan is describing, in order to reconcile those. And I just can't overemphasize how important that is, because again, if you're just drilling down into the silos with OKRs, you could have sales trying to do one thing that actually makes life very difficult for manufacturing. Marketing could come up with something that makes things very difficult for sales. So you need to align top down, bottom up, and sideways.
Yep. Excellent. Thanks. That's a great clarification, Dan. And then one of the things that I think Dan pointed, to the horrible anti-pattern of cascading objectives. which we all know is so bad in so many ways. One of the ways that you can kind of avoid that problem of having too much top-down flavor is by two-level and skip-level. Have these meetings where you're talking about objectives mandatorily inclusive of multiple levels, have them be collaborations where we discover alignment, and also have multiple horizontal adjacencies included in those meetings. Because if you've just got, a manager and a subordinate, or a director and a team, and the conversation's not including anybody else, ask yourself, are we leveraging this expensive meeting sufficiently to get good horizontal alignment and collaboration in the general circle of influence that this initiative or work group has? Or should we have included others to make sure that it's more transparent? So let's talk about organizational design solutions a little bit. And, Dan and I are both really passionate that the first step in a transformation or creating new organizational capability around strategy execution isn't just to do a reorg. We're not like one of the strategy consultancies who, spends a few months and a few $1 million putting together a PowerPoint deck of a new organizational structure and then disappear and call it done. In fact, organizational reorgs should only occur when informal organizational structures and work groups have become sufficiently established that they can actually inform and create tension in the legacy organizational structure. It's sort of like cow paths inform where you pour concrete for walking paths. Let the new organizational patterns form before you reorg. That said, de-emphasize the silos, right? These silos have had, in some organizations, decades to reinforce their primacy, to create rigid local optimizations, SLAs. Shared services groups are notorious for the flow of value and for locally optimizing to make their job easier and for them to get, their bonuses and rewards. Well, without formally reorging, start to tear down the power of the silo.
Right. That's the angriest little pony I've ever seen, Evan.
He's a mad little pony, and he's really doing some damage to that silo, isn't he, Dan?
Yeah, well, it needs to be done. Well, so let's talk a little bit about how you actually do that. So what we're talking about here is an important cultural shift, because we're not just relying on orders coming down through a hierarchy. We're actually asking more of people to look at how what they're doing fits in with the overall strategy and the delivery of value to a customer, and taking responsibility for making the kinds of lateral commitments across the value stream that are actually going to help deliver that. So that's not something that the CEO or the board is going to come up with, because they've got a different perspective. So what do you do when you're in the vast middle of an organization? So one approach to it is value stream mapping. So that's something that's been around for a while. Here's a typical kind of example where sales sells something, then manufacturing has to build it. Let's say it's some kind of a custom product, custom windows for your home, for example. Sales comes to your door and sells it. Then there's a little bit of a delay while manufacturing gets the custom order and makes it. Then it's got to be shipped and it's got to be installed. So you can break down here, there's time that each step takes, and there's time in between the steps. And the only way to really improve on this kind of a situation is to involve, sales and manufacturing in the interaction between themselves, or manufacturing and installation, or really all of them. So what does that actually look like? Could we look at the next slide? So that's a shared OKR. So what we're looking at then is that team 1 and team 2, say it's sales and it's manufacturing, get together and say, there's a key result that we want to work on together. And that's really important to breaking down the silo. They have a common purpose, a common measurable objective key result. The tasks they do will be different because they have different kinds of functions, but what they're doing is committing to ongoing conversations as long as that OKR lasts, be it a month or a quarter or a year to actually make it happen. So you can use this once you've identified a common problem, a bottleneck, something like that. And it's a way, because often what we see, back to Evan's point about reorgs, is that senior leadership is desperately trying to get the organization leaner and more focused on the customer. And what's happened, particularly with a lot of the big global companies that we work for, they build these matrices that are extremely complex. And so they get trapped in their own structure. And what we're suggesting is that if you could actually build the capacity in the organization for people on a more empowered, autonomous basis to see what needs to be done, build those mutual commitments, express them as OKRs, work them together, the need for reorgs would be less. And because reorgs are extremely disruptive, we've had some clients going through it and nobody knows who's reporting to whom or who's staying or who's leaving, often for 3 or 4 months. How can we avoid that kind of a problem and not lose those 4 months? The other point here is that we often see, if we go silo by silo, we end up with a whole lot of OKRs, OKR bloat. And we are more convinced than ever that less is more when it comes to OKRs. Focus on the things that are truly transformational. This is an example of what an OKR for that value stream would look like. So, maybe the 3 teams involved in it are mutually committing to reduce the order to delivery time, reducing the time between steps, and reducing order errors. The third one is an example of a countermeasure, because you can get a lot faster, but you might drop quality. So sometimes you need that. So it's not about just doing it fast, it's also about doing it right. So that's an example of what that kind of OKR could look like. Back to you, Evan.
So organizational changes that support alignment, generally these fall into the category of debureaucratization. I mean, we've created these many layered organizational bureaucracies that traditionally pass information and instructions up and down many layers. And that just doesn't work when competitive advantage really is conferred from knowledge workers on the periphery by the customer, understanding the customer, having deep empathy with their problems, and being empowered to make better decisions for the customer. So flatten the bureaucratic hierarchy, decentralize decision-making, push empowerment out to the periphery. In order for that to really be successful, it means that you're developing the employees, you're making sure that they really understand the definition of value and what the strategy is, and then they're going to make better decisions faster. And that also includes, the conversations we were having about, composite work groups forming organically and collaborating with one another in a network. So the last area of solutions that we'll share is around some policies and more specific techniques that help enable 360-degree or horizontal alignment. Dan?
Yeah, just real quickly here, what we're finding is that this kind of new way of aligning horizontally, being more empowered, being more autonomous, yet being aligned to the overall, demands a greater skill at dialogue. And we just love this quote from the book Execution, was a bestseller a few years ago, that dialogue in a knowledge organization is actually how you get work done. So it's very important to get better at that. And I'll just briefly show, if you move to the next one here, this is something that we go through in our training, talking about what are the different kinds of conversations you need to become more skillful at in order to make and manage commitments. And what we typically find is most groups get really focused on conversations for action. It's just like, okay, we're going to do this. Did we get it done? Why didn't we get it done? But you also need that kind of double loop learning where you're stepping back and saying, okay, are we actually framing the problem or the opportunity properly? Are we focusing on the most important thing? Are we documenting that with OKRs? That's what 1, 2, and 3 are. Then we move into action, but also at the very end, it's also important that we make sure we learn from it before we start the cycle again. So that's something we can get into more if you're interested. Back to you, Evan.
Yeah, another technique that we think is useful is linking OKRs. We talked a little bit about the nature of dependencies. There are a lot of other kinds of linkages. You can roll key results into higher level aggregate key results. We can automate triggers in the performance of key results that go to other OKRs in the organization. Having these linkages just so that we even have dashboards that show clearly key result performance from other work groups and other parts of the organization in a way that we can get to quickly and easily while we're updating our own, well, that contributes to transparency and alignment. Another technique that we've seen for decomplexifying data and improving transparency and accountability is being able to classify OKRs. In some certain types of really important strategic initiatives, like perhaps a digital transformation, we might label or tag certain sets of OKRs as being associated with the digital transformation as different from the normal operational divisional objectives that we're working on. These shouldn't be in tension with each other. They all need to be aligned with the larger strategy, but various forms of continuous improvement objectives might benefit from being tracked and segregated in reporting in a way that we can get to them quickly and add focus to things like continuous improvement or innovation that sometimes get deprioritized as the organization gets focused on operational performance.
One thing I'd just add to that is the term we use for these two things, Evan, is the transformational objectives are moonshots. And what characterizes them is that, frankly, we don't quite know how we're going to get there yet. So there's a demand for a much higher level of dialogue and learning. The ones on the right are roof shots. So we're clear that we know what to do to make a marginal improvement in the process, which is a good thing to do. There's less learning involved, but we just need to build the muscle and the focus to actually get it done. And sometimes those moonshots are really a series of roof shots. So they do interact with each other.
I hope that some of these techniques resonate with everyone. If there are any questions, we've reserved a good block of time for some conversation and tackling any specific questions or issues that you in the audience might have.
Love the term roof shot there, Daniel. That's good stuff. Gracie, I think some questions came in, or you have some questions lined up for these guys?
We do have some questions coming in. And the first one I want to pitch to you too, I think, is really recognizing that you've talked a lot about the structural supports that can promote or inhibit cross-functional goals. But I'm wondering if you could speak to, the question is really about what leadership behaviors support cross-functional goals.
Mm-hmm. I'll say something about that. I mean, generally, a transformational leader, leading what we call strategic agility, there needs to be a focus on not only getting the job done, but actually building the cultural and organizational capacity to have these conversations, to manage this kind of way. So I think that's an important difference. You can be a very good leader at the level of achieving a lot of stuff, but to really be a catalyst for change, you need to be empowering other folks.
Systems thinking is part of what I think Dan's referring to. And it's really being able to see the whole organizational system holistically and have a passion for continuous improvement at that level, rather than just an operational focus.
So Javier's got a question here, because you both were very vociferous that cascade. Yeah, exactly.
You don't cascade around me and Dan, man. No,
you were downright angry and hostile about the concepts of cascading OKRs.
Javier's my buddy for putting that one out there.
Javier is your buddy. He'll have a beer with you any day. Virtual beer on Evan, Javier. He wants to know, how do you craft OKRs to avoid cascading, or basically how do you avoid the inevitable mindset of cascading?
this is a behavioral thing, right? I mean, it's not a mechanical thing. So there's a cultural and leadership element, implicit in avoiding cascading. And it also means that in a lot of cases in large enterprises, you have to, one of the first things you have to do is recognize that your strategy execution program is separate from your performance management and incentive allocation processes. So what I mean to say is that at a very high level, the organization needs to have a strategy, and but the implementation of the strategy in terms of teams and individuals is really a conversation about those people, those teams and people, thinking about their span of control, what they can most realistically contribute from what they see in the market, the customer, and the organizational context that they're working in. And they're defining their own objectives in alignment to those higher level objectives. And we're not trying to do this artificiality of pushing, the CEO's objective down to the janitor in some artificially translated way that takes months. Dan, I know you got more to say.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit, that I think there is a level of mechanics or process that can help with this. So again, and I mentioned this earlier, what we typically do, it's a series of linked conversations. So we look at the organization as a whole. What are the big things that they need to do, typically on an annual or a longer basis? But then we also say, well, tell us about once we understand who your customers are, what are the key value streams that you're delivering to those customers and who's involved in those? So we kind of build that horizontal arrow across all of those silos. And typically every function or business unit is not going to be involved in that. So that kind of steps it down to, there may be 2 or 3 or 4 teams within the organization that are focused on a particular value stream. And typically then we say, okay, what would a quarterly objective and key result look like for that? Then we go down to the team level, because, what shared OKRs are you participating in? What longer term company OKRs can you participate in? And then we have to go back up to reconcile it all. But by the time you get through that, people typically tell us they've had like the best conversation about strategy they've ever had. Because it's not just the general talk, it's about what do I have to do with the strategy? What meaning and impact is in my particular job? But you can actually do that documenting OKRs as you go along. So I would argue that there is some process and structure to it.
Yeah, I agree. It's about the conversations and interactions as opposed to a mechanistic process, maybe is a better way for me to put it. But yeah. Exactly.
We often don't know exactly where a given conversation is going to go. So that's why we call ourselves agile strategies, because it's a complex thing to do. We need to just keep listening and move it where it wants to go.
It takes time to develop those muscles, doesn't it, Dan?
Yeah, it really does.
So could you speak to build off that? When you're a team crafting OKRs, should you really be looking at the OKRs that are one level above you? Should you be looking at the company's OKRs? How do you know what to draw on in terms of creating your OKRs, or what the balance is?
I'd answer, Gracie, I'd say yes and. First of all, I think you do look up at your departmental higher OKRs. You look at the company OKRs. If you have concerns that potentially the departmental OKRs don't align to the company's OKRs, you have a responsibility to inquire. And then, of course, as we've emphasized in today's conversation, there are a lot of horizontal and network perspectives that you want to bring into your planning as well, because maybe there are other work groups that are not in your linear hierarchy that really, for them to be successful, need some work from your work group or something that influences your OKRs. And that may not serve the departmental OKR directly, But ideally, as you look to the higher level strategy of the organization, the two constituent work groups can say, well, I see this is really an important strategy for the company. And so I'm going to find room in our work group to incorporate your OKR also.
I would just add too that in addition to that, often what we find is sometimes some teams can look at all of that stuff and then they get very hung up at a pretty tactical, task-oriented level about how do we contribute to all these things. So when we get down in those kinds of weeds, often what we do is say, well, like, let's just look at you as a group. Let's not just look mechanically at how you're contributing things, but how does it feel to be in your team interacting with the stakeholders that you interact with? And what are the headwinds that are making your job easier? What are the tailwinds that are making it more difficult? And we find that's a way to get the team even more engaged in like, okay, how does it feel? Because we're trying to get away from this old idea that, you know, the organization is a big machine, because it isn't. It's more of a biological metaphor than a mechanical kind of metaphor. And, you know, the team needs to have its own kind of intact morale and sense of mission and purpose. And so we want to bring in a lot of those gut feelings about, you know, what's working and what isn't working. What are the stakeholder relationships that are frustrating? What are the ones that work really well? And how can we tackle some of those bottlenecks?
Okay. So then building off of that, I'm curious to hear your take on this question. Does doing Agile, capital A Agile, innately set an organization up better for doing cross-functional goals?
Well, Dan and I will have a field day with this one if you let us. But attempting.
We only have 6 minutes, Evan.
I know. Attempting to impose a little self-discipline. Look, I think there's a real danger in capital A Agile because so often, especially in large organizations, they do Agile practices without adopting Agile mindsets. And I think it is absolutely helpful and positive to be a small A Agile organization to execute strategy more effectively. You will compete and win if you are an Agile business. I think that properly adopted as part of an Agile mindset, Agile practices certainly have less of an impedance mismatch than waterfall practices. So sure, but let's not just say that, you know, we're doing Scrum over here, therefore we're going to be successful in strategy execution.
I would just add that I think there's a lot that we draw on from Agile. You know, I've been an Agile practitioner, so has Evan. There's a lot we draw from when we're thinking about strategic agility, but it's a different level or order of meaning in a way, because I think with Agile, maybe not in theory, but in practice, Agile becomes about what is the most efficient way to build flow into the creation of features. That's often what the discussion becomes. So it's looked at from a larger perspective of what's the whole business or organization there to do. It's tactical, it's valuable, but it's tactical. So we're talking about strategic agility, which is more, are we even in the right business? You know, are we serving the right kinds of customers? You know, what else is changing that we need to do? So
are we experimenting with business models?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so
are we experimenting on our own organization in terms of our operating model and our management paradigms? Those are the kinds of things that a real lean agile organization is going to reinforce their competitive advantage.
Yeah, but I think in spirit, there's a lot of similarity. I mean, we see a lot of interest in OKRs coming out of the technical organizations within bigger companies, and it spreads out from there. And that's really been the history of OKRs anyway, starting with tech companies in Silicon Valley. And now everybody's doing it.
So maybe you could speak briefly then to how you see teams making this switch from thinking about tasks or project completion and more into strategic thinking. You know, what does that mean for a team further down in the organization chart to be collaborating on a different business model, et cetera?
It's that shift to impacts and outcomes. You know, most of the larger organizations that, you know, that we're all familiar with have a lot of metrics. They may call them KPIs. They tend to measure what's easy more than what's important. That shift from outputs to outcomes, which ultimately drive business impacts, is the core to that shift. And a lot of that is really understanding the key business drivers of the enterprise, of the value systems of the enterprise. What are the key levers? What are the leading indicators of improving business impacts? Anything you want to add to that, Dan?
Well, I think too, it's a matter of constantly learning and developing greater capacity. You know, it's not just getting stuff done faster, you know, just to add to what you're saying. And that has to do with that whole cycle of really spending some time saying, okay, how have our assumptions about the world that we're in changed since the last time we set some objectives? So you build that double loop learning in. And that's how you really continuously adapt and transform over time.
Great. Jeremy, do we have time for one more question? We have someone who really wants to know some ideas for creating more space for communication that can break the silos.
Well, I mean, we're at the hour and we try to deliver our OKRs end on time. So maybe one sentence and we can leave them hanging. But obviously, people can follow up with you too with further questions. So you want to take a quick 30-second soundbite out of Evan and Daniel?
Yeah.
What was the question again, real quick?
Gabriella said, how do you create more space for communication and break the silos? And should you exclude hippos from the conversation? Hippos being the highest paid person's opinion. It's kind of like decibel driven decision making. You know, or it isn't about excluding the hippo. Ideally, if you don't have to, if absolutely have to, you don't want to exclude the hippos. You want to retrain them. You want to become data driven. You want objective metrics of value that make the decisions. So you're using theory driven decision making and real data. And then, you know, the hippo's opinion, it either it's a hypothesis. It either gets validated or invalidated based on, you know, real data and metrics. And that's how organizations evolve. I certainly spent a lot of time in enterprise portfolio management, setting up more disciplined measures for allocating scarce resources.
I can't add to that.
Great. Well, obviously with the questions coming in, it's a good indication that people got some value out of this. So big thank you, Daniel, Evan, and Gracie for all of your help today. As I shared, the recording and slides will be sent out. And obviously Evan and Daniel are available to if you need to follow up with them. So thank you all. Stay safe. Happy holidays. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. It was fun.